Members, we now move to Ministers for our questions to the Minister for Justice, and I call Mr Brian Kingston.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question number 1.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Addressing ASB in any area requires partnership working, as it's rare that these issues are addressed by the criminal justice system alone. My department works collaboratively with local and central government, as well as other relevant agencies who have the levers to put in place joined up and long-term solutions to prevent incidents arising and to tackle the impact of ASB. The Department's interfaces team works alongside local communities and elected representatives to help address the issue of antisocial behaviour in areas around interface structures. In response to antisocial behaviour in the specific area, the Youth Justice Agency continues to actively engage with key stakeholders, including PSNI, social services, the Education Authority and other youth providers, to ensure a more joined-up problem-solving approach. The Youth Justice Agency currently operates an earlier stage diversion with partnership initiatives including its Targeted Schools programme, Community Resolution Scheme and a multi-agency Children's Diversion Forum, which has remained particularly effective in addressing wider systemic needs while ultimately diverting children from the formal criminal justice system. Additionally, the Department, along with the Northern Ireland Policing Board, provide annual funding for policing and community safety partnerships who play a key role in the Department's operational response to community safety issues, including that of ASB, across all communities. North Belfast DPCSP has funded a number of initiatives, including those focused directly on Girdwood and Clifton Park Avenue, and in recent months have coordinated multi-agency meetings to ensure a proactive and partnership response to issues in the area.
Mr Kingston.
Okay, I thank the Minister for the question, and it is indeed disappointing that we've had that upsurge, particularly during February and March, of a clash between groups of young people and sadly attacks on homes and on some individuals during those months. And the Minister's covered the question I wanted to ask as a supplementary about the cross-sectoral and cross-community work, which is essential to addressing this issue. But could I ask her maybe to respond that it's important that young people themselves within their peer groups and parents play their role in making clear this is unacceptable behaviour that needs to be brought to an end?
Minister.
I thank the member for that, and he is of course correct. The partnership working between the relevant agencies is absolutely crucial in dealing with this, and it is vital that there is a swift and coordinated response to problematic behaviours and also to the underlying causes of that behaviour. He rightly says that it is also important that communities, and particularly families, are cognizant of the impact that young people can have when they are potentially getting involved in activity that could bring them to the attention of the police and potentially damage them for their future lives. So I think it's important that there is that coordinated and joined up approach, and we certainly, in terms of supporting communities and ensuring that all communities, particularly those on interfaces, have a voice, are working on those community development plans in order to be able to offer that support.
Colin Killian.
I thank the member for bringing this question forward. Would the Minister for Justice agree with me that the more joined up approach at community level through education, with the police, CRJI and anyone else, including residents, is needed, because these attacks on the community, on individuals, on people's homes have to be condemned by everyone? Would the Minister agree that it's crucial that this funding that's needed is confirmed as soon as possible?
Minister.
Well, it is crucial, and as people will be aware from my previous remarks in this chamber, the issue of underfunding within justice is a significant challenge that we face at every cut and turn, and not just when it comes to antisocial behaviour. But it's not just the Department of Justice who have responsibility for this. Department for Communities has some responsibilities in this regard. The Executive Office, when it comes to interface issues, also has some responsibility around tackling sectarianism, and some of the attacks have been sectarian, others have simply been wider antisocial behaviour. So I think it's important that we work together as an executive in terms of how we respond to these issues, but also that we do that at community level. So we identify what the issues are, what the best diversions might be, and that we give our young people the best possible opportunity to avoid coming into negative contact with the police.
Dr. Aiken.
Question number 2, please.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I would like to answer questions 2 and 8 together, and seek your indulgence for what is a slightly longer answer than usual to the question in the first instance. Despite the pressures of an increasing prisoner population, prison officers continue to perform their duties with dedication, professionalism and skill. On the 1st of April 2021, the total prison population in Northern Ireland was 1,374. On the 1st of April this year, the population had increased by 37% to 1,886. At Maghaberry, as a result of the rise in population, the prison services reopened 2 of the 3 square houses, Foyle and Erne. This accommodation closed when Davis House was built, and that's NIPS's most modern accommodation. They are much less suitable environments for prisoners and more staff intensive to operate. Each square house can accommodate approximately 130 prisoners. On April the 1st, there were 54 prisoners in Erne House. Once Erne House reaches capacity, the only remaining accommodation is in Lagan, which is also a square house. Whilst ready for use, any decision to open Lagan is finely balanced, meaning that Northern Ireland Prison Service would be using its only contingency accommodation for use if there was, for example, an incident with regard to infrastructure that put another residential area out of use. The population of Magilligan is being carefully managed to sustain it as close to capacity of 500 prisoners as possible to alleviate ongoing pressure in Maghaberry. There are no immediate concerns about the capacity of Hydebank if the female population continues to increase. However, it may be necessary to reconfigure the use of accommodation on that site also. To address these pressures, prison services continue to recruit staff across all operational business areas in response to the pressures being experienced. Prior to the suspension of this Assembly in October 2022, I gave approval for the existing operational staffing level to be increased by 56 officers to meet the demands of the service. In the past year, Prison Service, in partnership with NICS HR, has undertaken 4 operational grade recruitment competitions. These were for custody prison officer, night custody officer, prison custody officer, driver escort and prison custody officer escort. Since January 2022, 315 officers have joined the service, the majority of whom have been deployed to Maghaberry Prison, given the particular pressures experienced there. Further recruitment will also take place.
Call Dr. Aiken.
May I thank the Minister for her remarks. One of the significant things that we in the Finance Committee recently heard from NICS HR was on the addition of the reform of the Occupational Health Service, and particularly for those prison officers. The Minister will be very aware that there is a considerable number of prison officers who have had their careers terminated by problems with occupational health. Could the Minister say if she's going to undertake a review of these issues, bearing in mind the fact that occupational health has been shown to have failed, and we should be doing something about reinstating these prison officers if they so wish to return?
Minister.
The management of occupational health within all grades of Northern Ireland Civil Service is a matter for the Department of Finance, and so it would not be within my gift to be able to undertake such a review as the member has suggested. However, it has to be said that there is not one simple reason for sickness levels in NIPS, and there are a number of factors combining to produce that effect. We also have invested in prison officers to offer them the support that they need to be able to return to work after injury, to be able to return to work under stress. But undoubtedly, in the situation where prisons become more crowded and more difficult to manage and more stressful environments, it will have an impact on retention and indeed attendance at work.
Nick Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers so far. Would the Minister be able to give a bit more detail on the impact that the rising prison population has on the ability to deliver rehabilitation work in prisons?
Minister.
Well, evidence demonstrates that a high prison population generally results in an increase in tension within the prison estate. Managing prisoners in terms of encouraging positive behaviour in particular becomes more challenging. For example, it leads to increases in assaults and incidents within the prison. Such behaviour also leads to an increased use of force, the number of adjudications and use of segregation, and that can all contribute to prisoners, particularly more vulnerable prisoners, feeling unsafe, and levels of self-harm tend to increase with very high levels of prison population. Of equal significance is the fact that staff themselves may feel unsafe, and as a result, sick absence levels tend to increase. Prisoners tend to be cooperative when they are treated with humanity and respect, and we saw that very clearly during COVID. In essence, when relationships between them and prison staff are positive and courteous. It is important that NIPS seeks to maintain those living conditions out of cell time and the delivery of a predictable and stable regime. However, if NIPS do not have sufficient staff available each day, it is not possible to offer a predictable regime. Restrictions increase, out of cell time reduces, relationships with staff will deteriorate, and ultimately the opportunity to engage in purposeful activity and rehabilitation will be curtailed, and that in turn may lead to increasing levels of reoffending.
Jim Allister. Minister.
No.
Following the disastrous Scottish legislation, can the Minister be clear, not evasive, where a biological man, for example, self-proclaims himself to be a woman, and a person calls them out by properly naming their biological sex, would that person, under her hate bill, be committing an offence? In other words, what's called misgendering, what I would call telling the biological truth, is that intended to be a crime?
Minister.
No.
Joanne Bunting.
Mr Speaker, the Minister will be aware that these are difficult and controversial issues, often involving competing rights. Could I ask the Minister if she will give assurance to this House that, give reassurance to this House around privacy in the home, and also that the PSNI will not be turned into the thought police?
Minister.
Mr Speaker, there is no intent to criminalise thought. There is no intent to criminalise opinion. Any legislation will be developed in accordance with Articles 9 and 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and as such will not affect people's ability to have private conversation. In fact, the intention in terms of freedom of expression is to extend the protections for freedom of expression to exist for all private conversations, irrespective of where it takes place, unlike the current situation where only in a private residence is it protected.
Paula Bradshaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Minister, can you clarify, for the avoidance of any doubt and for the benefit of some members, that you are not intending to criminalise free speech?
Minister.
Well, I thank my colleague for this opportunity. I have no plans to criminalise free speech. I have no plans to make a description of another person's biological sex a criminal offence. However, targeting a person because of who they are or what they believe, be it their race, religion, political belief, sexuality, gender identity or disability, is wrong. It is not necessarily criminal, but it is wrong. And from my perspective, the purpose of the hate crime bill, which will be brought to the Assembly in the latter half of this mandate, is to support victims and to send a clear message that hate crime in any shape or form will not be tolerated. The final content of the bill is still under consideration, but there is no intention to criminalise opinion. Thank you.
Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Minister, in fairness, you have come close to answering the question I was going to ask. Notwithstanding the motivations of the original questioner, I represent, as others do, the most diverse constituency possibly on the island of Ireland. Race hate crime now is higher than sectarian hate crime in Northern Ireland. Can you be specific that the hate crime bill that you will bring, and you say in the second half of this year, will get to the heart of the increasing levels of race hate crime we're experiencing in Northern Ireland, including in the wonderfully diverse constituency of South Belfast?
It will be in the later half of this mandate. I would be stretching my officials somewhat, I think, to manage to bring it in the later half of this year, but it will be in the later half of this mandate. It is absolutely the case that what we are trying to do is look to those areas which Judge Marinan set out in his report around stirring up hatred, around attacks that are motivated by hatred. We are not creating new crimes. What we are doing is taking into account the motivation for those crimes. So if no crime has been committed, then no offence will be seen by the courts. But where a crime has been committed against an individual and the courts are able to establish the motivation for that crime to be a hate motive, then that will be taken into account in sentencing and also, crucially, in the recording of that crime, because then that gives us a much clearer handle on the extent to which those from different ethnic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, and indeed those with different sexuality and gender are being targeted as a result of hate, some of which, I have to say, has been stirred up quite deliberately by those discussing the Scottish bill and the bill in the Republic of Ireland.
Before calling Orla Flynn, I just remind members that when they're asking questions, they're asked through the Chair, not directly to the Minister. Ms Flynn.
Question number 4, please.
Minister.
The care of people who come into contact with the justice system is of paramount importance to my department, particularly in the context of the work of Northern Ireland Prison Service, as we seek to care for and support people with complex and challenging needs, including mental health issues and addictions whilst in custody. Prison healthcare services are provided on behalf of the Department of Health by the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust. This includes primary healthcare, mental health care and addiction services. However, I recognise that everyone has a role to play in supporting people to look after their mental health and address addictions. My department is therefore engaged with a number of initiatives aimed at improving mental health and reducing the harm for people in Northern Ireland. These include my role within the Executive Working Group on Mental Wellbeing, Resilience and Suicide Prevention, engagement with the Mental Health Champion, whose role is jointly funded by all departments, the implementation of the 10-year Mental Health Strategy for Northern Ireland and the 10-year Strategic Framework to tackle the harm caused by substance use for Northern Ireland, reducing harm, empowering recovery, representation on the Protect Life 2 Steering Group and Towards Zero Suicide Collaborative Board, response to the recommendations from the review of services to vulnerable people detained in Northern Ireland prisons, and representation on the Forensic Managed Care Network. While people in prison are already supported by good mental health and addiction health care, there is of course more we can achieve through collaborative working.
Ms Flynn.
Thanks very much. I thank the Minister for a response. And I suppose contained within, she had mentioned a lot of those working groups, the Mental Health Champion, the strategies around mental health, substance use and Protect Life too. Would the Minister agree that pilots such as the custody suite pilot that was run in Musgrave and also the multi-agency triage teams that brings together the police, the ambulance and mental health practitioners, would she agree that rather than these just existing as pilots, it's really important that we get these rolled out right across society?
Minister.
I would agree, and the biggest impediment to that is funding, and certainly within the Department of Health there were genuine challenges in terms of being able to fund the psychiatric nurses who would be able to be part of those multi-agency triage teams. It is incredibly important that we are able to continue to develop that and to work together collaboratively across the executive to provide the kind of support that we need. I would prefer we did it before people came into contact with the justice system, because increasingly the people who enter the justice system have fallen through the net of other services, and justice is the only place left to go.
Stuart Dixon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Minister, thank you for your answer so far. Would you agree with me that this requires a cross-departmental approach to deal with the difficult issue of mental health in those who find themselves in prison? Having recently visited Maghaberry, I saw at first hand one of the most distressing cases of mental health, someone who in any other circumstance should never be in prison but should be in the care of the health service.
Minister.
Increasingly with very limited secure care facilities for those with the most serious mental health and behavioural problems, it falls increasingly to the Department of Justice to house those people. Their needs are complex, and the main prison population is not an appropriate place for them to be held. It is not the right environment, it is not a therapeutic environment, it is there for very different purposes. But rather than have people with nowhere to go, they end up in the prison system, and so we have to deal with that. It is incredibly complex. This year, as of April, 38% of the prisoner community was recorded as having a mental health issue, 51% recorded as having an addiction, and 53% as having a history of suicide attempt or self-harm. These are people with incredibly complex needs, reflective of many of the needs we see out in the community, but it is undoubtedly concentrated in the prison population. That is not something that the Department of Justice itself can resolve. It is something that the Department of Health, the Department for Communities and indeed other ministers need to make a contribution towards addressing.
Mark Durkin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister that when people are being bailed to an address outside or away from their own area, what consideration is given to the impact of moving them away from their support network and their ability to access required medication on the individuals themselves, of course, but also on the community in which they're placed?
The matter of bail and bail conditions is not a matter for the Department of Justice. It's a decision that would be taken by the judiciary or the police, depending on circumstances, and their health would still be a matter for the health service rather than for the Department of Justice. What we do and what we are trying to do is offer better wraparound and supported care for those, for example, who have additional health and mental health needs as they emerge from the prison system, so that we can, for example, identify accommodation and allow them to get a referral to a GP so that they can get continuity of treatment. But it is more difficult in the case of bail because it's not something in which the Department is actively engaged.
Alan Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Question 5 to the Minister, please.
Minister.
It remains my intention to include legislative provision for Charlotte's Law as part of a sentencing bill, which I hope to introduce next year. Charlotte's Law is intended to create measures to encourage murderers to reveal the location of their victims' remains in so-called no-body cases, and is being taken forward in light of a campaign spearheaded by Charlotte Murray's family and supported by the family of Lisa Dorian. Charlotte went missing in 2012, and in 2019 her former partner was convicted of her murder. He remains the only person convicted in this jurisdiction to date where the victim's body has not been found. The key elements of Charlotte's Law will be a significant increase in the murderer's life sentence tariff to reflect their ongoing failure to disclose critical information, coupled with the opportunity for a reduction in tariff should a post-sentence disclosure be made. Similar to Helen's Law in England and Wales, it will also require the parole commissioners to take the failure to disclose into account when considering the prisoner's suitability for release on licence at parole stage. Officials in my department have continued to develop the detail of the proposal, working closely with the affected families and other stakeholders during the absence of the Assembly and since return of the Executive. The findings of the public consultation, along with a way forward report, will be published over the coming months once this development work is finished. A number of the administrative measures I announced in November 2020 have already been agreed with the relevant stakeholders.
Mr Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that answer. The Minister will be aware of attacks on healthcare workers. I'm wondering, could the Minister clarify how this bill might protect frontline healthcare workers from attack?
Sir.
The bill that I intend to bring in terms of the sentencing bill will also look at creating an aggravating factor for attacks on healthcare workers. I actually referenced that, I think, earlier in the debate that we were having, and I will go on to elaborate further on some of the other measures, including around car incidents and how that will also be dealt with in the sentencing bill. So hopefully, if the member is still around after question time, he will get a full response on those queries.
Philip Brett.
I thank the Minister for her update. Can the Minister also then give a commitment that she will introduce Harper's Law here in Northern Ireland?
Minister.
The issue of Harper's Law is something that is under consideration. It is not something that has already been agreed by the Department, but we are looking at the potential to do something along similar lines to what is being proposed elsewhere. We will have to look at how quickly we are able to develop proposals where we decide to go down that route and how those would be applied in conjunction with the other regulations and laws that we have in place, but it is under consideration.
Doug Biddy.
Mr Speaker, and I welcome the information you've given, Minister, in regards to Charlotte's Law. But could I then also ask the Minister, will she also commit, as part of the sentencing bill, to look at the sentence reduction model for those who wait till the very last moment to admit guilt?
Minister.
It is, I think, something of a shock to most people to understand the degree to which as it's referred to rather casually as discounting of sentences, will take place. There are good reasons why people get a reduction in sentencing if they make a guilty plea. However, it should, I believe, be the case, and certainly in the case of Charlotte's Law, it will be the case that the earlier that disclosure is made, the more credit an individual will be given for making that. The later they leave it, the less credit that will be given. And I think it's important, if we're going to maintain that continuity, that applies across the board. But obviously individual sentences are a matter for the judiciary and not something on which I can interfere or comment. I am, however, aware of the concern that it causes when, for example, somebody goes through a lengthy period awaiting trial, often in quite traumatic circumstances, and on the morning of the trial somebody makes a guilty plea. And all of that pain and anguish for the individual has been in vain. And they feel that the perpetrator of the crime has essentially regained control over the person. And I do think that that is something that does need careful consideration.
Patsy Malone.
Thanks very much, Minister, for your answers. Minister, could you give us some sort of an indication as to what your legislative programme is with indicative times, please?
The intention would be, with the indulgence of the Executive and the Assembly, that we would be bringing forward a mixed content modernisation of Justice Bill before the summer recess, and that the committee would then have just over a year to process that. Then, when that is concluded, we would hope to bring forward a sentencing bill. And then third, when that is completed, we would hope to bring forward a Hate Crime and Victims Bill, which would include both the hate crimes provisions, some of the hate crimes provisions that were outlined in the Marinan report, but also some of the remaining victims arrangements that were proposed by Sir John Gillan.
Alicia McHugh.
I very much recognise the harm that can be inflicted by knife crime, and I'm clear we need to do all in our power to act to reduce the risk of harm in our community. That's why my officials are currently taking forward the necessary preparatory work to commence provisions in the Offensive Weapons Act 2019, which together will strengthen legislation in Northern Ireland pertaining to knife crime. These provisions will strengthen the laws around sale and delivery of knives and offensive weapons, particularly to those who are under 18. They will also strengthen prohibitions around possession of certain classes of knives and offensive weapons, meaning they can no longer be possessed in private. Before the change is introduced, a surrender and compensation scheme will be run. I'm confident that once commenced, these new provisions will strengthen our legislative powers to tackle knife crime.
Mr McHugh.
Thank you, Minister, for your answer to this point. But could I also ask you, and I welcome your commitment now to dealing with the whole issue of knife crime, if you could give us a time frame for when it is that you intend to bring forward legislation in relation to it?
Officials are currently developing a detailed work plan with timescales to commence the provisions in on that Act. Once completed, I will be sharing that with the Justice Committee. The work plan is broken down into two main work streams: the sale, delivery, possession of corrosive products and substances, and sale, delivery and possession of knives and offensive weapons. I would hope that both work streams, including the running of a surrender and compensation scheme, will be completed and provisions commence within 18 months.
Trevor Clark. Minister.
There are no immediate plans to undertake a fundamental review of the workings of Access NI. However, systems and process enhancements are routinely considered and implemented to improve aspects of the criminal history disclosure scheme. In 2023-24, Access NI processed over 176,000 disclosure applications across all three levels of check. The average turnaround times for issuing disclosure certificates for basic and standard checks was 1 day. The average for more complex enhanced checks was 4 days, with over 80% of those being completed within 2 days of receipt in Access NI. The digitisation of the Access NI process has been a notable success, both in improving the efficiency and cost effectiveness of the service. Indeed, this resulted in a further fee decrease from the 1st of April, making Access NI disclosure fees the lowest now in the UK. In recognising that the key asks from employers and voluntary groups are for fast, accurate and cost-effective disclosures, I consider the Access NI service is performing well and delivers in that regard. The long-standing key functional change for Access NI is the introduction of portable disclosures. Officials continue to work closely with the Disclosure and Barring Service to progress this as soon as is practically possible.
Mr Clark.
I thank the Minister for her answer. The Minister maybe would accept, given that there's many people with different types of employment require more than one, is there any opportunity in terms of a review to actually remove the duplication to prevent the individual having to go through the process and actually the further burden on Access NI processing those?
Minister.
One of the key issues is that disclosure certificates are only accurate on the day that they are issued, so employers who choose to accept an age certificate are doing so at their own risk, in the knowledge that information may have changed in the period since that certificate was issued. It remains my key objective, however, to deliver a portable disclosure solution. Technical aspects of that are complex, and work to date indicates that Northern Ireland, a standalone solution, is prohibitively expensive, and therefore we would not be able to take that forward in terms of passing that on to applicants and actually increasing fees. The long-standing aim, however, has been for Access NI to join the update service provided by the Disclosure and Barring Service for England and Wales, and that would allow us then, when they have reviewed their product, to deliver a more modernised solution that better meets customer and business needs, to be able to work with them to deliver a similar solution here.
All right, all right.
Question 9, Minister.
Minister.
If I may answer questions 9 and 15 together. Fundamentally, timelines of payment of legal aid are influenced by the available budget. For many years, the Department has been significantly underfunded compared to other executive departments and objective need. The previous Finance Minister recognised this in October 2022 and specifically referenced the pressure on the legal aid budget. The Fiscal Council also recognised the sustained underfunding of the Department. We must live within our budget, so all business areas have to ensure there is financial discipline. And for legal aid, this means that payment timelines become extended. In previous years, my department and I have consistently pushed for additional funding to meet the demand for legal aid. As the department cannot spend in excess of its allocated budget, and in recognition of the demand for payments and the impact on suppliers of legal aid and those seeking legal aid, the department secured an additional £20 million for legal aid in 22-23 and a further 14 additional budget in 23-24. The total legal aid spend in 23-24 was around £114 million. That is the highest level of expenditure in the history of the legal aid scheme. The additional funding assisted in improving payment timelines, and at the end of March 2024, properly presented Crown Court criminal bills were being paid within 9 weeks, with Magistrates Court within 11 weeks. While the additional funding is welcome, the historic approach of late allocations is not sustainable and needs remedied. That is dependent on Executive allocating an appropriate budget for the department, including legal aid, and I will continue to work with colleagues to seek to secure this in 24-25.
We have no further time for questions, so we move to topical questions. The Minister for Justice, Nicole Matthew O'Toole.
Mr. Speaker, Minister, were you consulted on the secondment of the Permanent Secretary of the Department of Justice to be Chief Executive of the Education Authority? Did you give your approval, and do you agree with the move?
Minister.
Well, the appointment of people to other bodies within the Department of Education is not a matter for the Justice Minister. It was discussed, it was brought to my attention that there would be a reshuffle following the ending of the recruitment for new permanent secretaries. My permission was not required, and it would not be for me to discuss whether or not somebody should or should not have been appointed to a job. But I want to wish my former permanent secretary every best wish in his new role and every success in delivering for education.
Mr. O'Toole.
Minister, you said it was discussed, but you didn't quite say whether you had given a view. But it does appear from the minutes of the Education Authority that the Alliance Party representative was the member of the Education Authority Board who formally proposed that a secondment be agreed. So can I ask you, do you think that the secondment of the Permanent Secretary meets the requirement to be, as you said, following the RHI inquiry, to be based on openness, transparency and proper accountability? Are you satisfied that it meets that test that you set following the publication of the RHI inquiry?
Minister.
Well, as I say, it is not for me to answer for the processes that are undertaken by other departments. And I would also gently remind the member, this is question time for the Department of Justice, not for the Leader of the Alliance Party. If he wishes to ask me party political questions, there are other mechanisms for him to do so.
Dan Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister indicate how she is working with the Police Service of Northern Ireland to make sure that the mistakes made by the Metropolitan Police last week and its attitude towards the Jewish community are not replicated here? And will you be issuing anything publicly to reassure the small and vulnerable Jewish community in Northern Ireland of their safety?
As part of my role in the Department of Justice, we engage with all minority communities throughout Northern Ireland, and I will continue to do that and to provide them reassurance in the political sense. However, how the police interact with members of any community is a matter of operational responsibility of the Chief Constable, not for me as Justice Minister, and it's something that really would be more appropriate for members of the Policing Board to take up with the Chief Constable at their next meeting.
Mrs. Dodds.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, reflecting on this incident with the Metropolitan Police, I'm sure you'll agree that the language that we use is extremely important. Your colleague from Upper Bann referred to a meeting in Portadown on the issue of RSE and the people who attended it as a dog whistle to the far right. Does the Minister think that this is acceptable language? And will she clarify if the PSNI would be interviewing her colleague under her proposed hate crime legislation for this particular remark?
Minister.
Well, first of all, I would initially refer the member back to the answer which I gave to Mr. O'Toole. If you want to ask me questions as Minister of Justice, I'm happy to take them. If you want to ask me, Mr. Speaker, if I may, if you want to ask me questions as Leader of the Alliance Party, there are other fora in which we can exchange. With respect to the tweet that was made, it would not be for me to say whether the PSNI will or will not be investigating any individual in our community. And furthermore, I would be rather surprised if they did so on the basis of prospective legislation rather than existing legislation.
Question 3 has been withdrawn. I call.
Minister, you'll be aware that last Friday, Antrim and Newton Abbey Borough Council held a series of events in recognition of the outstanding service by the prison service from Northern Ireland. The Minister will also be aware that much of the discussion there was some of the significant issues that I've already raised in questions to you today about who is actually responsible and accountable for the prison service. Could the Minister outline who has ultimate responsibility for the prison service of Northern Ireland and who has ministerial responsibility?
Minister.
Well, the member will know that the Director-General has operational responsibility for prison service and that the Minister of Justice is responsible as Minister.
Dr. Aiken.
I thank the Justice Minister for her comments. She will be fully aware that in her earlier comments she made issues when we were talking about a very important issue with mental health to do with prison officers, and particularly how they are due to deal with some of the significant problems they've had to do with employment. And I raised particularly the question about occupational health, but she referred it to the fact that it was an issue to do with the Finance Minister and not her. Where does her responsibilities actually lie for the prison service?
Minister.
My responsibility lies in setting prison policy. It lies in supervision of the Director-General and oversight of the budget. It does not, as a result of decisions that were taken prior to my time, lie with individual HR decisions, which are the responsibility of the Department of Health. And as a former chair of the Department of Finance's Scrutiny Committee, I thought the member would know that.
Trevor Clark.
Minister.
There's no point of order during question time.
I think the Speaker would know that. Minister, I'm going to try and ask you a question in relation to your portfolio. Okay. In relation to in relation to the budget process at the moment, I'm sure you're working up many bids, and given the conversation we've had prior to this debate about policing, can I ask how much you have bid for the policing in terms of that budget, or is it sufficient to require the 8,000 officers as requested by the Chief Constable?
Well, first of all, it is a one-year budget and there is no practical opportunity for us to increase policing numbers from their current state to 8,000 in 1 year, so it would not be sufficient to sustain 8,000 officers. However, it is in line with the unmet pressures which the PSNI have delivered to me. I have made those bids. In total, there is about £440 million of bids from across the justice system that have been submitted to the Department of Finance and are currently being considered against the approximately £1 billion of available funding for all departments. So the bids reflect what the PSNI have asked for.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Minister, for that answer. But given that's for £400 million for all of your department, could you highlight how much specifically is going to PSNI?
Minister.
It's in the region of 320 million, but I will have to check the exact figures. And some of that is for recruitment of, I think it's around 140 odd officers in the next year, and that's the intention. The maximum that we can realistically put through the police college, as you will know from your role in the policing board, is more limited, and therefore we are in a situation where by the time you take in attrition for people retiring and leaving the service and the limitation on numbers that can go through in a single year, we can probably only add around 150 officers per annum to the police numbers.
Paul Fruit.
The Minister has went to great lengths today to distance her hate crime bill with that of Scotland and the Republic of Ireland. Can the Minister give us further reassurance as to the differences between her hate bill and the one in Scotland and the Republic of Ireland?
Minister.
Well, I can certainly reassure the member that, first of all, the content of the hate crime bill in Northern Ireland is not complete. If you're interested in the first stage consultation on the Marinan review, the first stage consultation completed and is now published online, so you can read that. A second stage consultation will be issued in the coming weeks, and that will deal with a separate set of issues that need to be addressed before we decide how to go forward. But ultimately, the reassurance I give you is that all of this will have to be approved by the Executive to be brought forward.
Mr. Fruit.
I thank the Minister for her question, and of course that just because it goes forward from the executive doesn't mean that the committee work and this assembly work is vitally important with that. So that is really only one stage. The Association of Scottish Police Superintendents has warned that those who report hate incidents in Scotland that do not meet the criminal threshold could be left disappointed with police response, and those who are then investigated but have not done anything wrong may feel silenced by the officers, the police officers, therefore reducing confidence in the police. Can you reassure this House that you will not do anything within the hate crime bill that would reduce confidence in our police?
I have no intention of reducing confidence in the police. In fact, to the contrary, the purpose of the hate crime bill is to increase confidence in the justice system from those who may otherwise feel that they are not able to have the reasons for their crime properly addressed in court. But as I said earlier, it has to be a crime in order to be hate crime. And then we have to make out a separate motivation that there is indeed a hate motive. So that's the basis on which we're progressing our hate crime bill. I also have to say that, yes, people do report hate incidents that do not currently, for example, make the threshold. Those are recorded by the police for information purposes so that they can see, for example, if there are clusters of hate incidents, and they are then able to try and engage with communities to reduce that. Because let's be clear, whether something is criminal or just plain wrong, it does damage to communities. It causes real harm to individuals. And it is important that as a society, and I would hope all in this chamber, that we condemn those behaviours that alienate, that harass, that frighten members of our community who may feel vulnerable.
Mr Gildernew isn't in his place. I call Nick Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister clarify whether Northern Ireland will be included in the scope of the Horizon System Offences Bill in Westminster?
Minister.
I am delighted to be able to announce today in this chamber that yes, Northern Ireland will be included in the Westminster legislation with regards to the Horizon scandal. This is something which the First and Deputy First Minister and myself have worked very hard to achieve. We were very keen to ensure that people in Northern Ireland who were affected by this scandal were given equitable treatment and a timely treatment in the same way as people in England and Wales. I think the uniqueness of the Northern Ireland situation, the length of time that legislation here traditionally takes, and also the small numbers of people affected within Northern Ireland mean that it was, if you like, an exceptional case that they were able to include us in the legislation. And I think the UK Government have announced that today and will table amendments to that effect themselves later in the day. I am pleased to see that has happened. It will not undo all of the harm that has been caused by the original Horizon scandal, but it will hopefully at least ensure equitable treatment for our constituents.
Mr Matheson.
Mr Speaker, and thank the Minister for her answer, and I think it's one that members across the chamber will welcome. Would the Minister be able to confirm how many people in Northern Ireland she anticipates this will affect?
At the moment, the estimate by PPS is around 26 individuals. However, it is possible that as this comes forward, more individuals may emerge. One of my fears was that given the experience people had had of the justice system, given the false information that was produced by Horizon, that they may not wish to come forward and reopen that can of worms by going through an administrative process. This means that the convictions will be expunged by a process that will be underpinned by UK legislation, and it hopefully means that will be a swifter process and perhaps more people will come forward, but to the best of our knowledge, 26.
Tom Buchanan.
Can I ask the Minister what plan she has to addressing the ongoing backlog of cases within the justice system?
Minister.
We have a number of work streams within the criminal justice system. So I can only look at the criminal justice system. We have no levers over the speed with which things progress through the civil justice system because of the complexities of that system and the fact that that is driven largely by complainants and their solicitors. In the criminal justice system, we have a number of work streams within the Criminal Justice Board that are looking at how we can speed up justice, and we are, of course, keen to do that. We have great partnership working between the PSNI, the PPS, and the Court Service and the Judiciary. However, all of that has been brought about in terms of being able to catch up after COVID and so on by people working well beyond their capacity, and any further reduction in available finance for the Department of Justice will have an impact on the length of time it will take us to progress cases through court. I would also note that in terms of what I said earlier about the 114 million spent on legal aid this year, that is a direct indication of how many cases are actually going through the court because of the increased capacity of the courts, and that's why we've had the highest spend this year on record.
Mr Buchanan.
Thank you, Minister, for the response. The Minister agree that this delay within the justice system is a failing of our victims.
Response, Minister, please.
Well, with respect, they're not my victims, but it is certainly a failing of victims, and there is no question that it compounds the hurt and the stress and the anxiety that they are under. So that's why we have made it our top priority in terms of the justice system, in terms of how we actually get through those cases, and we are looking at both administrative but also at court-based procedures that will allow us to speed that up, and many of those are starting to take effect. However, it's a complex and a dynamic system. We do not control all aspects of it, and therefore we have to work in partnership with others.
We now move to questions. We don't take points of order during question time, members. I'm surprised people are asking. We now move to questions for Minister.